Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And I want to start by getting personal for a moment. What I'm about to tell you is not exactly groundbreaking, but it's a critical detail to understand what I'm about to discuss. Back in school, I hated assigned reading. Now I hated a lot of things about school, but that was always in my top 5. And it's not like I hated reading in general. I enjoyed it, so long as I read something I actually wanted to read. But most of the time, that restricted my reading intake to comic books, Goosebumps novels, and a few romance novels here and there. I understand why teachers assign books for students to read. I just never enjoyed the books they picked. They were often long, boring, difficult to follow, and just utterly uninteresting to me on any level. However, among all the books that were ever assigned to me in school, one book still stood out. One book managed to cut through my inherent disdain of this outdated educational practice, and that book was George Orwell's 1984. And to date, it's still one of my favorite novels. It's a famous novel in many circles, and for all the right reasons. Some people rank it among the best novels of the 20th century, and I'm inclined to agree with that. And I suspect many of the teachers who assigned this book understood that as well. And even though I'm not a fan of required reading, I do think everyone should read this book at some point in their lives. Because more than any other novel, this book tells a story that needs to be told. It is a book that has only become more relevant in the years since its publication. There is a reason why its sales often spike in conjunction with certain geopolitical events. But I don't want to belabor that aspect of the novel. Many others have already done so. Instead, I want to share how and why this book affected me so profoundly. And again, if you haven't read this book yet, I highly encourage you to do so. Because the message in 1984, as dystopian as it is one we cannot and should not overlook. It is impossible to overstate just how dystopian the world of 1984 is. I would even argue that it's the dystopia by which all other dystopias are measured. This is a world in which authoritarian rule has been taken to its utmost extreme. The world of Oceania, Eastasia, and Eurasia are vast in scale, but basic in structure. All notions of freedom, liberty, and choice might as well be forgotten dreams in this world. That's because every word, feeling, and idea we experience, every aspect of life as a whole, it's all defined by Big Brother and the party. Now, who is Big Brother? Who is the party? What are their politics, policies, and goals? Those questions, and any effort to answer them, are completely irrelevant. They don't matter in this world. Not anymore, they don't. Officially, the party is called INGSOC, short for English Socialism. But there's nothing English or socialist about them. They are little more than a name, and Big Brother is nothing more than a figurehead. Their only agenda is to rule with absolute power, and to continue ruling with such power. That's it. How they go about it, what they call it, who they antagonize, that may change, but the goals do not. The people they rule over are just a means to an end. And when I say their power is absolute, that's not an exaggeration. They don't just control the government, the economy, the schools, and the media. They practically dictate what words can be said and what thoughts can be contemplated. Anything that anyone does cannot happen without their sanction. It's a level of control that even the most ambitious dictator cannot hope to match. And those who dare deviate aren't just punished, they're effectively erased. It's not enough for the thought police to just kill someone who thinks the wrong thing or expresses the wrong opinion. They make it so those people disappear and are completely forgotten. And on top of that, everyone they might have known actually forgets they forgot. They might as well have never existed at all. That's what it means to be unpersoned. It's a scary level of power that has no real-world parallel. The idea of exercising such power over people is difficult to imagine. And that's where the main character, Winston Smith, comes in. This dystopian world he lives in is all he knows. And it's through him we experience the dark yet profound meaning of this book. Now, you can find plenty of stories about people who lived under ruthless dictatorships. These stories are important and revealing, and I encourage everyone to seek them out, just to understand their perspective. their harrowing stories have some similarities to those of Winston Smith, the main protagonist of 1984. However, Winston is no hero, freedom fighter, or John Wick super assassin. He's just an ordinary man living in Airstrip 1 on Oceania, a place once known as Great Britain. He's actually one of the fortunate ones in this dystopian world, relatively speaking. He belongs to what's called the Outer Party. They're basically the middle tier of the three-tiered social structure of Oceania. There's the Inner Party at the top, the ones wielding the power, enjoying what few luxuries there are left in this world. There's the Outer Party in the middle, the bureaucrats, administrators, and educated elites who support the Inner Party. And then there's the proles, the unimportant, uneducated working class masses at the bottom. All they do is eat, work, and breed. That's it. This structure is very rigid, and Winston plays a part in keeping it that way. He starts off as just another faceless bureaucrat. He works for the Ministry of Truth, a name that hardly fits, but I'll get to that later. His job is to revise historical documents so that they line up with what the party wants them to. Every fact, event, place, or person of relevance, it all must fit the wishes of the party. It doesn't matter if that means calling the sky red, saying cows are green, or calling broccoli candy. If the party says something is a fact, then it's a fact. Plain and simple. Full stop. You don't question it, you don't doubt where it came from. When the party says they invented the airplane, you believe it with every fiber of your being. And even if you wanted to question it, you wouldn't even know how to articulate such an idea. That's the extent of the party's influence. Winston is just one of the many cogs in that machine. He's not the only one either. His co-worker and inner party official O'Brien is a slightly bigger cog. And later on, his main love interest, Julia, acts as a catalyst for disrupting these tyrannical machinations. Together, their story helps us navigate both the facade and the underbelly of this world. And in doing so, we explore the how, what, and why of this vast authoritarian system. It's understandably bleak, but it also fleshes out the larger messages of this novel. It's certainly not subtle. Orwell goes heavy on the world building, and it helps make the scope and scale of the party's power that much more terrifying. Winston Smith's life in 1984 is fairly unremarkable when the book begins. The primary catalyst for the story that unfolds is a thought crime. And for thinking people outside this world, it seems like an absurd notion. But George Orwell makes it abundantly clear. This is a very serious transgression. Because it's not enough for Big Brother to censor what people say. He and the party actually target the source. Because the precursor to all speech is thought. While most of our thoughts never become speech, it's a simple calculus. Control those thoughts and you control all speech. But how does the party even go about that? How do you control someone else's thoughts without resorting to sci-fi tropes, some of which barely existed in Orwell's day? Well, 1984 finds a way, and it's a lot more disturbing than any psychic vampire MacGuffin. This is where things like Newspeak and black-white come into play. These concepts, which Winston himself helps further through the Ministry of Truth, reveal the full extent of Big Brother's control. The idea of Newspeak refers to the language that people use in Oceania. Like everything else under the party's domain, it's tightly controlled. This language has no words for concepts like freedom, agency, or defiance. You might be able to contemplate the ideas, but if you have no words for it, how do you even express it? It'd be like trying to articulate the concept of dry water or bright darkness. And the concept of Newspeak acts as a stepping stone to the idea of black-white. This concept is the endgame of policing both speech and thought. It's the idea of people accepting whatever they're told regardless of what other facts may say. If Big Brother tells Winston that black is now white, he believes it. Moreover, he forgets that he ever believed otherwise. He may or may not have some uncertainties, but because of Newspeak, he doesn't even have the words to make sense of such a notion. Within this dynamic, the very concept of truth becomes hollow. What you know to be true is now whatever the party says it is. To the average citizen, it's as objective as gravity, time, and heat. But to the party, it's as subjective as the stroke of a pen. It can change on a whim, and you can do nothing to resist that change. Your words are too limited, and your thoughts are too narrow. In essence, that's what makes a thought crime far more serious than jaywalking. To hold in your head a thought that Big Brother doesn't approve of is tantamount to treason. And you don't just pay a fine for it. The thought police will come for you. They'll arrest you. And they'll subject you to physical and mental torture until you think only the thoughts they want you to think. This is exactly what Winston endures. This is what anyone suffers if they so much as contemplate something Big Brother doesn't like. Ideally, these victims achieve a state called Crime Stop, a mentality in which citizens immediately purge their minds of any deviant thoughts, whatever they may be. It's an extreme form of cognitive dissonance. It effectively renders pointless the division between truth, lies, and everything in between. And it's this part of the book that I found most disturbing. Reading through Winston's mental deconstruction, this mental remolding he endures, it was downright scary to me. Entire notions of logic, reason, and understanding just broke down entirely. It gets to a point where he'll willingly believe that 2 + 2 is 5 if Big Brother deems it so. And he won't dare think anything otherwise. Ultimately, this is the mental state that the party wants for all its citizens. If nobody can think anything subversive, then their power is absolute. What they say is truth. Every order is obeyed. There's no way anyone could ever threaten their authority. That concept isn't even a concept in Oceania, and seeing characters fall into this mentality is a dark but compelling journey. It also has some major implications along the way. Throughout the novel, the narrative of 1984 and the larger message of 1984 perfectly complement one another. When this book was originally published in 1949, memories of World War II and the rise of communism were still fresh. The world had just witnessed the rise of authoritarian regimes. They saw the brutal extent that dictators and despots would go to control their population. Countries like Germany and Japan were already trying to rewrite the narrative surrounding their recent history. And growing empires like the Soviet Union attempted to shape perspectives on what it meant to be a communist, a capitalist, and a global citizen. Some countries still do that today. Just look at how certain news sites change the verbiage of certain stories. It may start by simply tweaking the words of a headline, but it certainly doesn't stop there. With the right words, presentation, and editing, you can get it to convey a very particular message, one meant to conjure a very specific type of thought. From those thoughts come actions in the present, but it has to start with the perceptions of the past. Orwell saw people in power trying to change the facts of history, even when it was still fresh in everyone's mind. It's an ambitious effort, to say the least. It's also very different from the era of kings, peasants, slaves, knights, and nobles. Modern civilization requires a different level of tyranny to ensure absolute power. The dictators of the 20th century couldn't just use brute force or widespread propaganda. World War II proved that only went so far. Those brutal methods may bring temporary order to a chaotic situation, but not much else. People eventually turn against those kinds of tyrants, if only because brute force bullying doesn't quell their rebellious inclinations. The perfect authoritarian, as embodied by Big Brother and the party, takes it 10 steps further. In Orwell's world, brute force is more a relic of old-school tyrants. Thanks to modern technology, they have the means to subvert minds, bodies, and hearts on a mass scale. But even with such means, it's not an easy task. Stalinist Russia certainly made the effort. North Korea continues that effort to this day. But 1984 articulates what the end results entail. And it's not a pretty picture, even for those within the inner party. Those in power seek ever greater methods of controlling the populace. Whereas kings and emperors of old only had whips and blades, Big Brother has far more advanced tools, which allow for a far greater capacity for control. And like any well-oiled machine, they're always looking for ways to refine that process. There are cameras everywhere in Oceania. Mass media, a system that was still emerging in Orwell's time, had been effectively weaponized to further the party's agenda. Orwell even described the extent of the endless propaganda. It's the only thing people ever hear. And it's the only point of view that anyone ever knows. Through TV, radio, and controlled news, everything is filtered and framed a certain way. People are fed messages and information meant to shape minds and subvert rebellious thinking. And if people don't buy in, the thought police takes care of them, by which I mean they torture them or just make them disappear. Thanks to the technology Orwell envisioned for the future, This could be carried out on a mass scale, far greater than anything any tyrant had ever attempted in history. Every aspect of society, culture, and industry is dictated by the party. Instead of just beating people into submission, the party molds their thoughts and behaviors into something that's submissive by default. They keep the people pacified yet energized, strong yet vulnerable, engaged yet detached. It perfectly mirrors this doublethink mentality, holding contrasting views in their minds as though they're both true. They keep hearing Big Brother tell them that war is peace, slavery is freedom, and ignorance is strength. And they buy into it. To them, it isn't even tyranny. It's the world they live in. And they don't just tolerate it, they love it. That's what made that last scene in the book so ominous. Winston, despite being tortured and losing the woman he loves, declares his love for Big Brother. It's a dark ending, but one that hammers home a darker message. This is what total tyranny looks like. This is where blind authoritarians lead us. Obedient, broken, and completely under their control. Like I said before, the level of authoritarian control that Big Brother exercises has no real-world parallels. Yes, countries like North Korea make an effort, but the results are hardly perfect. The harrowing stories of people who escape are proof enough of that. In 1984, the story explores the greater implications of authoritarian trends. And even without taking it to the utmost extreme, it still sends an important message. Those seeking power and control have many agendas, but they often resort to similar methods. They seek to control the media, they seek to control the language, they seek to control the very thoughts that people think, both directly and indirectly. They'll say they have an agenda which is supported by indisputable facts. They may even claim that a certain group of people are the true tyrant seeking power, and they're the ones who must be stopped. In 1984, the party labeled the old robber baron capitalists as the enemy. But logistically, it really could be anyone, be it a religious minority, a racial minority, a political party, or just anyone who disagrees with them. They won't police your thoughts, but they will create the kinds of words and slurs meant to shape your thinking. Think of terms like fascist, incel, cuck, SJW, liberal, terrorist, etc., etc. Wannabe Big Brothers will gladly expand your vocabulary in that context, but only if you buy into the world they want to create. And it often gets very hostile and very hateful. Mere discussions about differing opinions can turn into a virulent war of words. Seeking truth is no longer the goal. Winning the argument, defeating your enemies, vindicating your point of view, that's all that matters. Call it owning the libs, call it defeating the fascists. At some point, usually after that wannabe Big Brother gains power, things escalate even more. Buying in is no longer voluntary, it's enforced. We may not have a modern-day thought police, but we do have people in parties who use similar tactics. They'll throw around terms like fake news, alternative facts, and fascist around to derail rhetoric. It doesn't even need to be imposed by a government or a tyrant. It's just something people do to themselves. Be it a brand, a lifestyle, a political movement, or even a fandom. It all comes back to power, either maintaining it or gaining more of it. In Orwell's time, communism was at the forefront of this conflict. Calling someone a communist in the 1950s was on par of calling someone a terrorist, a cuck, or a libtard today. And in actual communist countries, the script was flipped, but the goals were still the same. Calling someone a capitalist or an intellectual was considered a gross insult. It was used to effectively shut down debate, reducing every discussion into a show of focused hatred. That's why in 1984, it didn't matter what the party called itself. English socialism might as well be called Chinese democracy. Both the methods and the endgame are the same. Absolute power over the masses. Absolute control over words, ideas, and thoughts. A never-ending conflict against an evil other. Oceania could be at war with East Asia one day and Eurasia the next. It still wouldn't matter. So long as there's an enemy to hate or an adversary to blame, Big Brother's power persists and propagates. The never-ending blame game is something Orwell witnessed in his own lifetime. And we're all witnessing it too, in the media and in our general discourse. Now, it has never gotten as bad as it does in 1984, but seeing it taken to such an extreme helps put these things into their proper perspective. Because if we're on this dangerous path, we cannot forget where it ultimately leads. That was part of Orwell's warning. But it still gets worse than that. It's one thing to get swept up in a social or political revolution. Many of us have gotten caught up in such movements or hate mobs at some point in our lives. The internet and social media has made it distressingly easy. But getting caught up in those movements is not the same as completely submitting to it. That's an extreme you don't get outside of serious religious cults. In 1984, Big Brother is beyond even the greatest excesses of cult-like control over people. Yes, they'll control the population with basic propaganda. Winston even describes it with the daily 2 minutes of hate, a social ritual that effectively ingrains that us versus them mentality that's so critical to any authoritarian regime. But to completely submit to Big Brother on every level, as Winston ultimately does in the book, it requires a more intimate measure of control. And it's here where the novel takes its most disturbing twist. Because once Winston's thought crimes are exposed, he's not just tortured as punishment. He's pushed to a point where he utterly submits himself to Big Brother. It's a heartbreaking, soul-crushing moment. But what makes it so disturbing is how personal the torture is. Again, this isn't some medieval torture on par with beatings, burnings, and crucifixion. Remember, Big Brother has a more modern, refined form of torture. One meant to remold its victims rather than simply cause them great pain. That involves taking something that the victim already dreads. In Winston's case, it was rats. Yes, that's somewhat generic, but in the grand scheme of things, it could be anything. This just happens to be what O'Brien, operating on behalf of Big Brother, uses to break him. It got Winston to renounce his love for Julia. It got him to descend completely into the crime stop mentality. In the end, he only loves Big Brother. Nothing else matters to him. This is his only truth, and it's exactly what the party wants for him. It's what they want for everyone. Winston's torture in Room 101, as it was called, detailed the extent to which Big Brother would go. Human beings had to be managed at every level to ensure their submission. It's not just about breaking their minds. O'Brien even talks about reworking the entire human body. That includes utilizing other modern tools that tyrants of the past never had access to. At one point, Winston learns of the party's plan to essentially rewrite people's sex drives through medical tampering. Through the Anti-Sex League, they seek to turn sex and procreation into a function as mundane as paying your taxes. Because anything that is intimate or passionate that doesn't involve Big Brother is a potential threat. And Winston already knows this. After all, it was his love for Julia that played a big role in his initial thought crime. To control this aspect of the human experience is a kind of control that no king or emperor of the past could ever hope to achieve. When everyone is mentally and physically submissive to Big Brother, then their power is both absolute and uncontested. From an authoritarian standpoint, it's perfect. But for everyone else, it's terrifying. This, in my opinion, is the book's greatest achievement, crafting a story about tyranny taken to the utmost extreme. George Orwell crafts it as something that we, as thinking, feeling humans, should do everything to avoid. Like a good horror movie, it terrifies us with its methods and themes. But at the same time, it does instill a sliver of hope, one that still resonates today, even as the world continues to change and evolve in ways Orwell himself never could have foretold. The overall concept and perception of Big Brother has changed a great deal since Orwell's time. And I think it's telling that he never gave Big Brother a full name or identified the leader who helped foster this gross authoritarian system. Because in the end, it really didn't matter. What ultimately mattered is how it affects the people living in it. They're the ones the party seeks to control. Without them, their power is meaningless. And this is where I find a surreal balance in 1984. Reading this book was such a harrowing experience, but even as I read through Winston's torture, a few key insights came through. Winston had lived his entire life in this world. Big Brother, Oceania, and the extreme levels of control he lived under, it's all he ever knew. And despite all that, he still deviated. He still committed a thought crime. It didn't take much, even with all the propaganda and newspeak bombarding him every day. he still somehow went against Big Brother's tyranny. And even if Room 101 broke him, it's worth noting the context. This is what it took to break one man, one seemingly ordinary man with no remarkable skills, trainings, or insights. This all-powerful, all-encompassing system of repression has to go to these lengths to control people. And even then, it doesn't always work. It speaks to a certain essence of the human condition. This drive, this feeling, and this inclination to resist tyranny. No amount of propaganda or oppression can fully stifle it. We still see ourselves as individuals. We still have our own thoughts, passions, and inclinations. Big Brother has to control that in order to ensure absolute power. But Big Brother still struggles to carry this out, even with modern tools. After I got over the distressing details of Winston's submission, I found some comfort in that. And I also understood why Orwell had the book end this way. Winston, after all, could be anyone. He's not Che Guevara, George Washington, or some famous revolutionary. He's no different than the countless real people currently living under real dictatorships. Like those people, he alone cannot hope to resist the full force of Big Brother's control. But the fact it took so much to break him, I think that says as much about the tyrants as it does about the people they oppress. The threat of authoritarian dissent is still very real today. It's just very different from what it was in Orwell's time. But I think if he were alive today, he'd see reasons for concern. People still get caught up in social and political movements that lead to powerful people taking over. Those same people can lose their sense of identity. They'll rarely see themselves as tyrants, but that won't stop them from employing Big Brother's methods. Now, it may never go to the same extremes depicted in 1984. It may even be the case that such tyrannical control is impossible. Human beings just aren't wired to be ruled in such a way. But that still won't stop would-be Big Brothers from trying. And we need to be aware of those efforts so we can resist them. For me personally, George Orwell's 1984 gave me a new appreciation for freedom, choice, and agency. My personal politics have changed, but the extent to which I value these things has only grown. And to everyone out there trying to make sense of this chaotic world, especially when it comes to politics, I highly recommend reading this book. It may be a dark, dystopian world, but it's a world that reveals so much about our own. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Take care, stay safe, and don't forget, Big Brother loves you.